Well, I hope this video finds you well today in these times. And today we're going to focus mainly on one of the letters that Paul wrote to one of his young converts and apprentice, Timothy. We'll be reading mainly from 2 Timothy, but Timothy is an interesting case in the fact that Timothy's mother was a Jewish woman and his father was a Gentile. And Timothy did a lot of missionary work, especially in Greece, and Paul wrote letters to him as sort of in his training and preparing him for his upcoming ministry. We're going to focus mainly in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, but before that in verse 1, Paul basically says, I charge you, and that sounds very legalistic, and it is, and that the Greek translation in that word charge has a legal meaning in the court of law, and it means to basically testify in front of a jury or a judge. So Paul is calling on Timothy to testify to God's word, to not just be able to recite it or to be able to call it into recollection, but to be able to live it and to believe it and to agree with it and take it upon his own truth. But we go on to verse 2, which was our focus is today, and it says, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. What I think Paul is trying to prepare Timothy for is that there's going to be tough times, and you're going to have to be able to preach and continue to teach God's word even in the roughest of times, even when you don't feel like it, even when you're in the valley and not on the mountain. There's a story of a Church of England clergyman who, once he was took Christ into his heart, all he did was preach. And he preached and preached into his own congregation until he converted all of them. And then he continued on to preach even more. And he preached to the neighboring churches and their congregations and converted all of them. So much so that the other clergy actually complained to the bishop that all this guy does is preach. Well, the bishop actually went and spoke to the clergyman and says, look, you're kind of making your fellow clergymen look bad because all you do is preach. And he replied to the bishop, he says, look, I only preached 2 seasons. The bishop was relieved. He says, well, which seasons are those? Well, in season and out of season. Well, see, that clergyman got it. He understood that God's word is not something that just comes and goes with the season. It lives within us. And really, how we respond in those seasons in our lives is our sermon and is our testimony. We're in a season right now. We're in the fall season, and we're in the holiday season. We're in the pandemic season. And how we respond to these seasons in our lives is basically our testimony and our sermon to others. And so what we hope is that we're living a life with God's word being the inspiration, that the way we respond to the ups and downs, the ins and outs of seasons, is what draws people closer to God and away from their own understanding. And that just like Paul was trying to get through to Timothy, he's trying to get through to us, is to preach in season, out of season. Always be on. Never phone it in and never be off. And that how you respond even in the toughest of times is a testimony to God's word and his teaching within our lives.